ನಂದೇ
ಮಾತಾಡೋವರೆಗೂ
ನಂದೇ ಈಗ
ಅವರು ಇಂಟ್ರೊಡಕ್ಷನ್.
Namaste everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Namaste.
Very clear, very clear.
Okay, thank you so much. So it's wonderful to be together again. And whenever we think of great masters like Sri Ramana Maharshi or any enlightened beings, it is a satsang. We are automatically in the company of Jnanis, Sat. So within us, the awareness that we are happiness, as so beautifully Janki Ram put it. Janki Ram ji, thank you for your wonderful introduction and for a brief summary of last week's talk. So let us begin with the Guru Shloka, Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, and Asatoma Satkamaya, from untruth may we move towards truth. Those two shlokas, let us chant together, keeping our audio on mute. Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha, Gurur Sakshat Parabrahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Asatoma Sadgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Let us offer our pranams at the lotus feet of Sri Ramana Maharshi and all the great masters of wisdom. May their grace and blessings flow to us in great abundance and light the lamp of awareness within us. Thank you for joining me in the prayer. As we saw last week, Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi, who took Mahanirvana, who left the physical realm in 1950, is still remembered, celebrated by seekers who follow the path of self-inquiry. He is known all over the globe because his teachings are very generic. Even though we may use Vedantic terminology when we explain Bhagwan Ramana Maharshi's teachings, in essence, it does not invalidate any belief system or any religion. It can be followed by seekers who belong to different cultures, different countries, different faiths, without any conflict with their own cultural background. So that is the beauty of Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi. Last time, we also briefly went through the early milestones of the great master, where he was born, who his parents were, and what were the circumstances under which he got enlightened at the early age of 16 years, and how he went from his home, which was in Madurai, to Tiruvannamalai. And once he reached Tiruvannamalai, he never left the place again, ever, till the end of his life. As years passed, the world came to him. People from all over the world traveled to Tiruvannamalai, which was just a very small town in Tamil Nadu. But Bhagwan Ramana Maharshi never went anywhere. So we also looked at how Upadesha Saram. Upadesha Saram, Upadesha means teaching, Saram means essence. So the essence of Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi's teachings are there in these 30 verses or shlokas, which we are going to study over the next perhaps 15 weeks or so. We looked at one shloka also last time. Briefly, we saw how one of the disciples of Bhagavan, his name was Murugannar, a very, very famous poet in Tamil. He has written a lot of poetry, which is still well known. And Murugannar was writing a poem about a legend which comes in the Shiva Purana. When he came to a portion where Lord Shiva gives his teachings to a set of ascetics who are performing rituals in the forest for the sake of getting supernatural powers. So Lord Shiva wants them to realize that action or even supernatural powers or performing rituals is not going to ultimately lead them to the realization of their true nature. So to make them understand, Murugannar, Shiva begins to give his teachings, and Murugannar at that time is unable to write. His pen stops, his poetry stops flowing all of a sudden. And he realizes that his guru, Sri Ramana, whom he regards as the embodiment of Lord Shiva, is the best person to write these teachings. So he goes to Bhagwan Ramana and he pleads with him, Bhagwan, would you please write these shlokas and complete my poem? So Bhagwan very graciously writes 30 shlokas. So these 30 shlokas, they give us a wonderful roadmap. So when we look at a roadmap, for every seeker, we need a roadmap, just like we need a map when we go to a new place. So if we have observed in any roadmap, many different features are shown and pathways connecting them are shown. And then there is a red dot or a star or something with a label saying, you are here. So unless we know where we are in that map, it is not possible for us to orient ourselves and to explore the premises. So Bhagwan begins from where we are. That's the beauty of it. In 30 shlokas, Bhagwan is giving us, Bhagwan Ramana Maharshi is giving us insights, very, very valuable practical insights into Karma Yoga, the path of action, Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion, Raja Yoga, the path where we control the mind, and Jnana Yoga, path of knowledge, ultimately culminating in self-enquiry or Atma Vichara. He says that no matter which path you begin in, Karma, Bhakti, Jnana, ultimately you have to come to self-enquiry. That is where all paths culminate, and self-enquiry leads you to self-knowledge. So last time we had taken up one shloka. I'll just share my presentation now. So 1 minute. Can one of you please tell me whether you can see the presentation? Is it visible to you? Can someone confirm whether presentation is visible or
Yes,
not?
yes, madam. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. So in the first shloka, we will begin by chanting this shloka. It is in Sanskrit. Bhagwan Ramana Maharshi composed Upadesha Saram. Upadesha is teaching. Saram is essence. So he composed this first in his own native language, which is Tamil, and he called it Upadesha Undiyar. Later on, at the request of devotees, he translated this himself into Sanskrit, later into Telugu and Malayalam, two Indian languages, regional languages. So we will just chant this shloka so that we can take a brief look at what we spoke, what we discussed last time. I will chant once, and keeping your audio on mute, you can all repeat it. Karturajnaya prapyate phalam. Karturajnaya prapyate phalam. Karma kim param karma tajjadam. Karma kim param karma tajjadam. Together. Karturajnaya prapyate phalam. Karma kim param karma tajjadam. So Ramana is saying, your own past actions, that means what I did yesterday, figuratively, yesterday can be any time in the past, is bearing fruit and becoming my present. And whatever I do today is going to bear fruit and become tomorrow or any other day in the future. Therefore, what we call destiny, what we call fate, is being determined by our own action every moment. What I have done in the past, the result of that, today I am experiencing. What I am doing today will come to me in the future as my destiny. So Bhagwan is saying that every action that you perform bears fruit. We also saw last time that our three instruments of action, body, mind, and intellect, with which we are very familiar, are powered by consciousness, powered by awareness, powered by what we call the self, or what Upanishads call Brahman or Atman. So without this presence, like Janki Ramji reminded us during his introduction, this body is a corpse. When the body disconnects from the self, it becomes a corpse. Everything that is part of the body continues to exist, but the body cannot perform any of its functions. The mind cannot perform any of its functions. The intellect cannot work. So therefore, Bhagwan is saying, since the instruments of action are inert, by themselves they are inert. Unless we power it, it doesn't work. We took the example of electricity also. If we look at the next slide, you will see in the first part, the first picture on this slide, we have a picture of the electric bulb. In one place, the first part, the left side, the bulb is not glowing. On the right, the bulb is glowing. So here, there is no electricity to power the bulb. Here, as soon as electricity is linked up with the bulb, it has started working and giving light. So in the same way, the body, mind, and intellect, which are our instruments, unless they are powered by the self, they cannot work. They are inert. By nature, they are inert. But we forget, don't we? So we keep thinking, my body is doing this work. I am getting these ideas. So my intellect is making these decisions. We keep identifying with the body, mind, and intellect. And this identification with the body, mind, and intellect is what is called ego. Ego is nothing but the feeling, the belief, the strong thought which has deep roots, the thought that I am the body, mind, and intellect. And Vedanta says again and again, this is an illusion. Don't believe this thought. You are actually the unlimited self, which is everywhere all the time. So if we look at what are the factors that govern the results of our action, when I perform any one action, what will be the result of that action? Now, in any action, my body, mind, and intellect are all involved. Last time we took an example of cooking in the kitchen. So if I'm cooking, the body is performing all the actions that are required for the cooking, cutting the vegetables, boiling water, etc. My mind can either be completely involved in the actions, or there can be a general feeling of benevolence towards those for whom I'm cooking, or the mind can be thinking random thoughts, or again, the mind may be feeling a lot of resentment. Why is it that I am caught in this kind of work? I would prefer to be doing something else. So with a lot of anger, with a lot of resentment, I may be doing the cooking. And the mind may decide, now this job is very, very important. Given the current situation of COVID-19 around us, all the people for whom I'm cooking should remain healthy, they should be fit, I should give them good nutrition, I should nurture them, not only with this food, but with my healing energy, with my love. So my mind may be in that very benevolent mood, and my intellect may say, take enough time to make this food nutritious and tasty so that all those who eat may relish it. So in the first case, where I am cooking with resentment and my intellect is saying, just be done with this. It doesn't matter if the cooking is not good, if things are dirty, if you have not boiled things properly, whatever, there's too much salt. Don't worry about it. Just finish it and be done. So if you look at the second picture on the slide, there are 4 people pulling. There's a tug of war going on in 4 different directions. So in this case, there will be a tug of war in 3 different directions. The body will be doing one thing, mind wants to do something else, the intellect wants to do something else. So we also saw last time that there is a relative scale of karma. The Upanishads tell us many times forcefully, karma is not just physical action. Karma is also what you have in your mind, what you feel, what you think, and it is also what is there in your intellect. It is also the ideal that is powering your entire life, which is giving you a focus in life, how to live, how to take my responsibilities, how to have my relationships. So there is an ideal. Now in the beginning of this talk, Ram so beautifully read out the prayer for us. The prayer of the school, which was actually written by Dr. Annie Besant, which says, "O hidden light, shining in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every atom." So that is an ideal. The same energy, the same awareness, the same consciousness that is within me, the life that is pulsating within me, the light of awareness that is pulsating within me, is also within every atom. It is also within every creature. So the minute I feel that I am one with my maker or my creator or God, immediately it also makes me one with every other in creation. So that is a beautiful ideal. So the same Dr. Annie Besant, who has authored this beautiful prayer, she tells us through her clairvoyant investigation that there is a scale, relative scale for karma. We need not actually bother about the figures that are given. They are only indicative. So she says, if 1 is the scale given for physical action, if you do a good physical act, you will get +1. Bad physical act, you will get -1. If you think a good thought or good emotion, you may get +5 or +10. Bad thought, bad emotion, -5, -10. If you have a inspiring ideal that is always guiding your life, giving you inspiration every moment of your life, so that will be +125. If you have an ideal that is harmful to others, like Hitler had, so then it will be -125. So all these together will make up the resultant karma of one single action. So then, if you look at it, action doesn't mean only physical act. Every thought has its own karmic result. Every emotion has its own karmic result. Every physical act has its own karmic result. Every ideal has its own karmic result. So if you look at the third picture in the slide, you see a human head filled with many different images. So during the day, neurologists tell us we think about 50,000 to 70,000 thoughts in a day. So all these thoughts, most of them are unconscious thoughts. They're not even aware. The mind is just thinking random thoughts, innumerable thoughts. Some of them are useful. Some of them are very good. We need them. They are task oriented. They are needed to resolve a problem. They're needed to make something go well. So these are all task oriented thoughts. But in between tasks, the mind is just in idling mode. We have driven in a car somewhere. We are waiting at a signal. Car is not moving. It is waiting for the signal to change. But the engine is running in idling mode. So like that, a good part of the day, our mind is running in idling mode, simply churning out thoughts, random thoughts. Or it could be focused on some pet grievance, some pet project, something to which we go back whenever we don't have tasks. So these random thoughts are mostly unconscious. They're generated by what we call vasanas or residues. Residues are formed when we keep on thinking the same kind of thought. Then certain karmic residues, like if we walk on wet earth, it leaves footprints behind. So every thought we think actually leaves its footprint behind. When we keep thinking the same kind of thoughts, if I'm used to thinking complaining thoughts about others, about the things that are happening in my life, I keep on thinking thoughts of resentment, thoughts of grievances, then this becomes a certain frequency for me. It becomes a vasana. So whenever my mind is idling, I could go back into critical mode, I could go back into resentful mode, I could go back into anger mode or jealousy mode. Or if I'm used to being very appreciative of other people, if I'm always looking for positive things, if I try to help people whenever I can, I'm observant about how people are feeling and I try not to hurt them, to promote, to bring out the good qualities in the people who are with me. If this becomes my way of thinking, my way of being, then this becomes my frequency. So every thought, every emotion, the more we indulge in it, it creates a groove. Even in the brain, it can become a thinking neural network inside the brain. So these vasanas normally decide, these residues normally decide what kind of thoughts we think when we are in idling mode, when we are between tasks, when we are not focusing the mind on anything. Then these vasanas take over and they start churning out thoughts. So every thought has a karmic fruit. So per day, 50,000, 70,000 karmic fruits coming from thoughts alone. So these are all factors that are governing the fruit or the results of every action. So when I'm doing a physical action, how is my mind? what is the state of being of my mind? Benevolent, or is it thinking ill of others, or is it just in neutral mode, not really thinking good or bad, but just some random neutral thoughts? All this will decide what will be the final resultant of my action. So Swami Vivekananda puts it very beautifully. He says, any action that you undertake is going to have mostly mixed results, because it is so difficult to control your mind. Our mind, I'm talking about myself also, so difficult to control the mind. So if we take just a few examples, now we have all been students, or we have currently children, grandchildren who are studying for exams, or they are in school, they have tests. Now we are sitting down studying for an exam or for a presentation in the office. We are getting ready, we are preparing. And as we are preparing, the mind goes to so many different issues. Oh, I should have told the newspaper guy not to put any newspaper from tomorrow. Let me come back. I'm again going back to this. Then again, oh, I should have called that person. Shall I call him now? So the mind, even when we want to focus it, it keeps on wandering, controlled by vasanas. So it is very difficult to control the mind. Somebody has studied very well, sitting in the exam hall. The paper is there. That student has studied everything that is there asked in the paper. He knows every single question actually, because he has gone through it just that morning. He takes up his pen. He wants to write. The mind blanks out. The stress is so much. The fear is so much. I may not perform well. Performance anxiety. The mind blanks out. So he is unable to control the mind. Then he goes out, writes whatever he remembers. He goes out of the hall. And after that, the thought of his bad performance in the exam is haunting him for days together. He wants to forget it. He is unable to forget. In the exam, he wants to remember whatever he read. He is unable to remember. We don't want to be angry. We make a resolve not to get angry. But when something happens which really provokes us, we become angry. So Swami Vivekananda says, because your mind cannot be controlled, because it is always churning out things which you don't want, it may churn out, which you want, it may not churn out. Not that this happens all the time, but a good part of the time. So you keep on generating mixed karma. So Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi is telling us, see, using these three instruments, the body, mind, and intellect, which are not completely in your control. The body, today it is healthy, tomorrow it may become sick. Today it is young. Slowly it is going to become old. It will lose, the faculties will deteriorate. So the body, many times we can't control. A little bit we have control. Mind, sometimes we control, many times we can't control. Intellect, there is clarity a good part of the time, and many times there may be confusion. We may make good decisions, sometimes we may make bad decisions. So because these three instruments can never be completely in your control, whatever you generate, even if you have a goal, a perfect goal in front of you, still it cannot generate consistent actions which will give you that goal exactly. It is very difficult to do that. That's why we have this practice of performing puja. If you are a Hindu in India, you may do a fire ritual, or you may sit down and worship a deity. So normally we have something called Kamya Puja. Kama means desire. Puja is worship. So Kamya Puja means you are performing that ritual for attaining a certain goal. It may be the goal of abundance. It may be the goal of good health. It may be the goal that you want a child, you want to get married. It may be any kind of transactional goal in life, general well-being of the family. So when we sit down, normally we have priests who assist us in the ritual, or we go to a temple. Temple has a priest. So before that puja can be begun, that ritual can be begun, normally we do something called sankalpa. Sankalpa means a very strong thought, a very strong thought form, where there is no other distraction. Only that focus is held in the mind very strongly for a few moments or a minute or a few minutes maybe. So before we actually take the sankalpa, that means before we define what we want from that puja, the priest tells us, do some pranayama, do some breathing exercises, regulate your breathing. Because when you regulate your breathing, all of us have noticed, through the breath, we can control the mind. Through the mind, you can also control the breath. So if we breathe slowly and deeply, the mind calms down. When the mind is calm, the person who is assisting you in the puja will say, now meditate for some time. So you will meditate because your mind has calmed down after all the slow, deep breathing. Your mind is calm. When the mind is very calm, the priest will say, now take the sankalpa. In your mind, bring the goal, bring what you want from this ritual. Bring that very strongly to your mind, concentrate on it. Don't allow other thoughts to come and dilute at that moment. So this, when we do that, when we hold that strong thought, we are safeguarding against this. We don't want random innumerable thoughts to come and mix up that karmic fruit. So very carefully, we are trying to prepare the mental ground so that no distractions come up, opposing thoughts. Suppose my Kamya Puja, my Sankalpa is, I should get good marks in this exam. I may have doubts about my own ability. So at that point, these doubts should not come and weaken the thought. So to weed out all such things from happening, to ensure that we get this strong sankalpa, we do these preparatory exercises. But now, most of the time, these things are not adhered to. In a puja, the priest will say, pranayama, pranayame viniyogaha, please do pranayama. Then we'll say, and then next, okay, meditate, 2 seconds. Okay, now sankalpa. So it doesn't work. We get a mixed bag of karma. But still, even though we may do Kamya Puja is allowed by Vedanta, it is allowed by most religions. But the best kind of action is selfless action, not to focus on any personal benefit from the action. That Bhagavan will tell us in the 3rd sloka. We will see a little later. So it is very, very important, if we want a consistent fruit from an action, the mind and intellect have to be very focused. So if the mind and intellect have to be very focused, we have to be in a state of constant awareness. And most of us know that we are not in a state of constant awareness throughout the day. Awareness is there sometimes, not there sometimes. So there is we are conscious of what we are thinking and doing. We are also unconscious of what we are thinking and doing a good part of the time. So this will automatically influence the karmic fruits that we get from any action. Now, last time we had stopped at a place in the story of Bhagwan's life. We said that Bhagwan came to Tiruvannamalai and he was constantly immersed in bliss. Not that he was in any state of tapasya because his sadhana was over. He was already established in the self. But that overwhelming bliss was so strong and it was intoxicating and new to him. So he just wanted to be immersed in it all the time. So he would sit somewhere, close his eyes. He would be aware of what is going on around him, but he would always be in bliss. And he didn't talk to people or interact with people. He didn't try to go out and get food, etc., because these were not important to him. He didn't want to come out of that bliss, or he didn't want to interact with the world because he wanted to be immersed in bliss. So this went on for a few years. Now, during this time, one devotee came to, in spite of that, devotees gathered around him and he acquired a reputation. So one devotee who came to him, one day, he asked Bhagwan, his birth name is Venkatraman, but nobody knew it. So he asked Bhagwan, where were you born? What is your name? Till then nobody knew his name. People would call him Mauni Swami, which means the silent ascetic. People would call him Brahmana Swami, the one who is always absorbed or immersed in Brahman or the self. So various names people had given him, but nobody knew his actual name. So this devotee who had been coming for some time, he asked Venkatraman or Ramana, he said, what is your name? Where have you come from? So Bhagwan took up a piece of charcoal or something that was lying there, and he wrote on a wall that was behind him. He wrote Venkataraman, comma, Tiruchuli. That was his birthplace. So for the first time, everybody came to know, oh, this boy, this 17-year-old boy who came here, now say 20, 21-year-old youth, he's actually educated. He knows how to read and write. So we can ask him things and he can write replies. If he doesn't want to talk, if he feels like writing, at least he can write replies and clear our doubts. So a new era began when questions would be asked and sometimes Bhagwan would write and give answers. So because he had written his name and his birthplace, slowly rumors percolated down to Madurai, which was some distance from Tiruvannamalai, where Bhagwan's mother, his uncle, lived. And people began to hear there's a boy called Venkatraman who was born in Tiruchuli. He is in Tiruvannamalai. So immediately, Bhagwan's uncle, who had been searching for him for the past 3 years, he rushed to Tiruvannamalai and he saw Venkatraman. He tried to talk to him. He tried to convince him to go back to his hometown, but Bhagwan did not even respond to him. So he went back, and Venkatraman's mother, Alagammal, she came to Tiruvannamalai. She came very determined, I will take my son back. So she came and she actually started weeping at the sight of him. Her son, his hair is long and matted. His body is covered with dirt. His nails are so long. He's so thin, as though he's not eating anything. He's just wearing a loin cloth. Can this be my Venkatraman? My son, who was so dear to me, in this state? So she sat in front of him and she said, my son, it pains me very much to see you like this. Why don't you come back? We will not bother you in any way. We will take care of all your physical needs. You can continue to teach or you can be immersed in your bliss. It doesn't matter. We just want you there so that we can take care of you. Why don't you come with me? Bhagwan is sitting very still. No answer. So day after day, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, Alagammal, his mother, comes back. She talks to him. She weeps in front of him. She pleads. He is not responding. He says, inside, later on. he has told his disciples, yes, I felt for her. I was melting inside. But if I had shown any kind of response, she would have begun to hope that I would go back with her. But it was not to be. I knew that it was not to be. So I did not respond. I sat like a stone. I sat like a statue. Then one of the disciples, all his disciples were there. They also felt bad. This poor mother is going through so much of agony. So one of them said, Swami, why don't you write a response to her? Okay, we understand you don't want to talk. It's fine. But why don't you write something so that she has something to look at, something to understand what is going on inside, what is your decision. So Bhagwan wrote on a piece of paper. These are the words that I put on the slide. I'll just read them out. The ordainer makes each one act according to one's prarabdha. That is the karmic result of one's actions. What is not destined to happen will never happen, however much one may seek to promote it. What is destined to happen cannot be averted, however much one may seek to prevent it. This is certain. The best thing, therefore, is to remain silent. So in one angle, if we look at this, Bhagwan is giving a reply to his mother. He is saying, it is meant that I should be here. I cannot come with you back to a place which I cannot now call my home. I will have to stay here. It is better for you to accept it. But there is a much deeper meaning. It is a great teaching about acceptance. He is saying, the ordainer makes each one act according to one's prarabdha. So Vedanta classifies karma into three categories. One is prarabdha karma. Prarabdha karma means the karmic fruits that have brought into this lifetime, that will shape my life in this lifetime. That is called prarabdha karma. Sanchita karma. Sanchita karma means accumulation. So Sanchita karma is all the karma, the sum total of the karmic fruits that I have accumulated in all my lives till now. So that big, it is like a bank balance, karmic balance. Prarabdha, from the bank, I draw a little money, I put it into the wallet so that I can use it this day for whatever expenditure I have. That is prarabdha. I just bring it down into this lifetime. Agami karma. Agami means that which will come in the future. So whatever I am doing today, it will come with the fruits of this action, this thought, this emotion, this ideal, this attitude. It will come back to me sometime in the future. So Bhagwan is saying here, the ordainer makes, we think of the governing principle as God or the ordainer or the creator. The creator has one law, and this law is that whatever you do, you will reap the fruit of that action, and that will shape your destiny. So there is no other destiny. God is not saying this, let this happen to you, let this not happen to you. Every action, using all three instruments, thought, feeling, physical action, decisions, attitudes, all of that together, every moment, whatever I do, my inner state of being, all that will determine my future destiny, just as what I did in the past is now at present determining what I experience. Then we are a little puzzled. Then does this mean that everything in life is predestined? What is not destined to happen will never happen, however much you try. What is destined to happen cannot be prevented. This is certain, Bhagavan says. So, Bhagavan is actually, in some of his other teachings, he says that karma works in two ways. Sri Narasimha Prabhuji, who is guiding me on the path of self-enquiry, he has explained this very beautifully. He says, one way in which karma manifests is through outer situations, external life situations, the people who are in our lives, the family into which I have been born, the situation, my economic situation, this family is rich, this family is poor, or the kind of values that this family has, the country into which I am born. So all these external situations. Now the COVID has come, world karma, global karma, for all of us, we are experiencing the same thing outside. But inside, each one of us are responding differently to the outer situations. So one, karma acts through external situations. That means people, circumstances, relationships, economic factors, culture, country, religion, etc. That is superimposed on us from outside. From inside, the vasanas, the residues that we have within us. That is the second way in which karma operates. And the way that these vasanas operate, it gives us an illusion of free will. If somebody asks me, will you have coffee or tea or soup? There is a vasana inside me that will prefer one of the three. Or it may say, nothing for me, thank you. Or I'll have a glass of water. This is all coming from my inner conditioning, my likes and dislikes. I like this, I don't like that. I have a predisposition towards this. I have a repulsion towards the other thing. So this like and dislike, the vasanas, which govern many of our decisions, which also decide how I respond or react to outer circumstances. Some people may have a lot of courage. We read of accounts. In fact, I know one person who was subject to corona. He got the infection. He's an ardent sadhak. So throughout, he came out from the infection. He is now fully recovered. He was one of the first people to get infected in Bangalore. So he says, throughout my illness, when I was in isolation in Sanjay Gandhi Hospital, which is one of the hospitals dealing with coronavirus treatment in Bangalore. So when I was there, he says, all the time my mind continued to observe, okay, this is happening to the body. My mind is thinking in this way. So I continued to be in a state of awareness. As I was just witnessing, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. I'm not affected, I'm the self, but this is happening to the body, mind and intellect. And he said, I used to do japa of my mantra. I used to, most of the time, even when I had high fever, I would just be observing what is happening to the body. So his reaction was different. Somebody else who gets corona, today I was hearing about somebody, he ran away from the hospital after 1 week and then he committed suicide in his house by hanging himself. So somebody else may react in this way. This will depend on their vasana. Vasana is nothing but conditioning, which is operating within us. Most of the time, this conditioning operates unconsciously. So we can just look at a story. It's a story which is narrated by many great masters to show us how the mind keeps on returning to unconscious mode of vasana in its operation. So there was this lady, there was an old lady who had been very miserly her entire life. She's very stingy. She doesn't like to help people. She's all the time thinking only about herself and her comforts. So she is living alone. Many times people would come and ask her for some help and she would totally refuse. Then she heard one day somebody saying, if you don't help anybody, then you cannot go to heaven. We think not only about our life here, we keep planning for afterlife also. So she said, okay, now I want to go to heaven because heaven is said to be very beautiful, very pleasant. So I should do something. One good act at least I should do. So that day a beggar came to her house and he begged for food. Then she thought, what shall I give him? There was in her garbage bin one rotten carrot, which she could not use in her cooking. So she took that carrot and gave it to the beggar. He took it and went away. Now 5 days later, the Lord of Death, whom we call Yama, he came and he said, okay, grandma, your time is up. Come on, come with me. You have to come to hell with me because you cannot, you have not done anything to help anybody. I have been checking all your karmic records. There is nothing. So come on, it's time. Come to hell with me. So this old lady said, no, there is some mistake in your records. Please check again. 5 days ago, I gave one rotten carrot to a beggar. So Yama checks again. And he says, yeah, I do see that entry. Okay, so because that is there, I will have to allow you to go to heaven. You do one thing, grandma, just stand outside your house. A golden carrot will descend from heaven. So when that golden carrot descends, catch hold of it quickly. It will take you to heaven. But there is one condition. At no time throughout your journey should you let go of the carrot. If you let go of the carrot, you cannot get into heaven. So this grandma, she stands outside, the golden carrot comes, she holds on to it and she starts rising up in the air. Now outside her house, there is a vegetable vendor. Arey, grandma is going somewhere. Seems like some kind of a miracle. Let me also go with her. So he holds on to her feet, her ankles. He is being born. Then his son, Arey, my father is going somewhere. So he holds on to his father's feet. So like this, a long human chain of some 20 people. The grandma is holding the carrot and everybody else is holding on to each other. The old lady doesn't realize that other people have latched on to her. So she's going on, she's very happy, she's at the gate of heaven. Then she thinks, before I enter heaven, let me take a last look at the earth where I lived for so many years till now. And she looks down. And what does she see? There's a whole chain of people who are holding on to her. And immediately she says, no, I don't want all of you to go to heaven. You didn't give the beggar that rotten carrot, I gave it to him. So to say I gave it to him, she lets go of the carrot and takes both her hands to her chest. I gave it to him. At that moment, she and all the people who are holding on to her, they fall down to the earth. So finally, the vasana that was strongest in her, that means she doesn't want to help anybody at any cost. She wants to benefit from everything for herself. She should have the good things and other people should not have it. So that vasana, which was so strong in her, that dictated what happened to her. So this story is told only to remind us that the vasanas which are strong in us, every moment, they are deciding what we do, what decision we take, what choice we make. So this dual action of karma, from outside through circumstances, from inside through vasanas, Bhagavan says, if you don't have a sharp viveka, which can be aware of every vasana, which can witness vasanas and help you to respond to every situation without going through your conditioning. A fresh response. Jiddu Krishnamurti calls this choiceless awareness. You're choiceless. You don't have, I want this, I don't want this. That raga, dvesha, like and dislike, they're not operating within you anymore. So you are choiceless no matter what happens. It is fine with you. It doesn't affect you because you are the witness. You are not the body, mind, and intellect to whom these pleasant or unpleasant things are happening. So when we don't operate through our conditioning, then there can be free will. But for most people, without being aware of it, we are operating through conditioning. Very, very easy if we keep watching how every decision we take, it keeps coming from conditioning. It keeps coming from like and dislike. It keeps coming from deep-seated impressions. So as long as we are anchored in these deep-seated impressions, Bhagavan says, everything in your life will be predestined, even though you may have the illusion of free will. So if you want to exit this cycle of being trapped in the karmic roots, in the last sentence, Bhagavan gives us the solution. He says the best thing, therefore, is to remain silent. So this remaining silent is not being, it's not a state of not talking. It's a state of inner silence, inner acceptance. So whatever is happening outside, within me, if I'm in a state of witnessing, if I'm not reacting to what is happening outside, then if I'm not identifying with my body, mind, and intellect, but I'm aware that I am awareness, I am the witness, then whatever happens outside has no power to impact me positively or negatively. I am bliss, I am silence, I am peace. So Bhagavan is saying this is the best way to deal with whatever is happening. You have no control. You have already performed those actions in the past. So their fruits will come back to you. But the best thing that you can do, remember, each time you react with that circumstance, you react negatively, you resist it, you resent it, you have self-pity about it, then you are actually sowing fresh seeds that will sprout in future. So the same thing will keep continuing for you. So the best thing is to remain as a witness, to remain silent within. So there is a example in Bhagavan's, among Bhagavan's disciples. I have taken up only one example. We have this lady called Echammal. Her name was Echammal. And she was, before she met Ramana Maharshi, she was in a village which was close to Tiruvannamalai. And in this village, she was living with her husband. She had 2 daughters, 1 son. She was quite happy. So some kind of epidemic came and her husband died, her son died, 1 daughter died, all within a span of a few days. They all died. So she was very, very grief-stricken, and then she thought, what will I do here? Let me go back to my hometown. So she took her 1 remaining daughter, who was 10 or 12 years old, and she went back to her hometown. Within a few months of going back to the hometown, this remaining daughter, she also died. So Echammal had no family, all gone. Within the space of a few months, she has lost everybody. She doesn't know what to do. She says, for whom will I live? For what will I live? What purpose does my life have? Why is everybody whom I loved, why have they been taken away from me? So many people come and they console her. They tell her, go for some tirtha yatras, go for some pilgrimages. That will help you. So she goes on pilgrimages. She learns yoga. She does japa. Nothing helps her. She's all the time under the burden of tremendous sorrow. Sorrow doesn't leave her. It haunts her day and night, every moment. She is under deep sorrow, deep depression. One day, somebody tells her, you know, there is Tiruvannamalai, where Arunachala mountain is there. There is a wonderful sadhu there. Why don't you go have his darshan? Maybe he will help you to come out of this kind of grief. So immediately Echammal goes to Tiruvannamalai. At that time, Sri Ramana Maharshi is living in Virupaksha cave. It is a cave somewhere 2/3 up the mountain of Arunachala. He is living in that cave. Echammal goes up the steep steps, goes to the cave. Ramana Maharshi is sitting inside. Echammal stands in front of him. She can't speak. She doesn't know what to say. She just stands there and tears start rolling down from her eyes. Silently, continuously tears are rolling down. She's looking at Bhagwan. Bhagwan is looking at her. Tears are rolling down from his eyes also. Echammal says, I could feel the grief just flowing out of me. Just flowing out of me. At the end of maybe 1 hour, I just stood there without saying anything. Bhagwan did not say anything. We were just looking at each other. But at the end of 1 hour, not one drop of sorrow was left in me. I was light and free. My mind was so silent. There was no resentment. There was no self-pity. There was nothing. There was just quiet witnessing, that's all. So look at that heavy burden, very heavy burden. We can't even relate to it actually, it's so heavy. So that heavy burden of sorrow by the act of being silent. Therefore, the best thing is to remain silent. That she understood not through words, but it was communicated to her through a state of being. So this is how Bhagwan says, when you become a witness, you accept that whatever is happening outside, I have no control over it. I have set this chain in action. I myself have set it in action. Through my past actions, I have made it happen. It will now go on like an arrow. Prarabdha karma is often likened to an arrow. When you let an arrow go from the bow, you can't stop it in between. It will reach its course. So let that happen. It doesn't matter. But it will trouble me. I will go through ups and downs inside. There will be inner turbulence of happiness and sorrow, boredom and excitement, etc. Only if I identify with the instruments of body, mind and intellect. If I identify with my conditioning. But if I disidentify, if I detach myself from my conditioning by witnessing, then automatically I am in a zone of no gravity. The gravity of vasanas cannot pull me. I am in a zone of grace, no gravity. Then, no matter what happens outside, inside I am peaceful, inside I am happy. So, let us move on to the second shloka of Upadeshasaram. I will chant it once and we will all chant it together after that, keeping the audio on mute. Krutimaho dadao patana karanam, Krutimaho dadao patana karanam, Halama shashvatam gati nirodhakam, Halama shashvatam gati nirodhakam. So I will begin with Phalam Ashashvatam. Bhagavan says, let us say that whatever was your desire, it manifests. I have been wanting a BMW car for a long time. I get it. I wanted to build a beautiful house. I build it. I wanted to get married. I find a wonderful spouse and I get married. I wanted a child. I have a child. So whatever is the goal in life, let us say you attain it. But remember, phalam ashashvatam. Phalam, the result of your action, the fruit of your action. Ashashvatam is not permanent. It is only temporary. I get the car. Immediately I'm very happy. Then slowly I realize each time there is a scratch. Somebody rubs past my vehicle in the heavy traffic on the roads. There is a scratch. 20,000 rupees for one scratch. One part goes. 15,000, 20,000, 25,000 for a part. Then what starts happening? My joy at getting that car, it starts getting adulterated. Adulterated with frustration, adulterated with maybe disappointment. I was very happy when I got married. All of us, we were very happy when we got married. Slowly, the complications of marriage, my partner gets angry, or he does things which make me angry. He does things that I don't like. I do things that he doesn't like. So the joy of finding an ideal partner, it starts getting diluted. So Bhagavan says, any happiness, anything that comes to you in the external world, or even the joy of the mind, remember, it is temporary, it is momentary. It is going to get diluted, it is going to evaporate. And then you will seek one more thing. You will seek to satisfy another desire. In your entire life, how many desires have you not fulfilled? But which desire has given you permanent happiness, lasting happiness? Nothing. So remember that even after all the analysis you have done, after reading the first shloka, let us say you get certain things that you want. You don't get a mixed bag for some action. You will get a complete bag of good karma. You wanted it, you got it. But even then, the joy that it brings you, it is only momentary. So like this, kriti mahodadhau patana karanam. Kriti, from every action springs many other actions, from every desire because of which you perform an action. That will lead to many other desires, many other actions that have to be performed. As an architect, I design houses for people, interiors for people. Then they build their house. The minute that house is built, it costs 2 crores or 3 crores. Then they have to get the wardrobes done. They have to get an open kitchen. They have to get beautiful furniture, more desires. To satisfy all that, you need a host of servants to maintain that house, more desires. You do that, you want the garden to look beautiful, so you get somebody to landscape it. Then you have to maintain that landscape. You need people to maintain that. You need money to maintain the house and the garden. So it goes on and on and on. From one action, you will get a whole ocean of action. Kriti mahodadhau. Maha is huge. Dadhau, ocean. You will get a huge ocean of karma. From every single action, you will get a huge ocean of karma. Patana karanam. This ocean of karma will be your downfall. We see so many people today in the world, they are so focused on material goals, they forget ideals, they forget ethics, they get into corrupt practices because they want to attain that. So in many different ways, from one action, we create an ocean of fruits, karmic fruits, and that ocean of karmic fruits will start pulling us in multiple directions. They create conflict in the mind, they create conflict outside for us, and that becomes our downfall because we slip from our goal of spiritual goal of self-knowledge. Gati nirodhakam. Gati, your progress. Nirodhakam, it stops. So this huge ocean of action, it stops your progress in life, progress on the spiritual path. So with this slide, we will stop for today. This is the last slide we are going to look at today. Now, a forest. Many of us have gone into forests. We have gone on animal safaris. We see huge trees of all kinds, fruit-bearing trees, flower-bearing trees. And then in the thick undergrowth, there are many kinds of birds and animals. Every forest begins with a single tree. Every tree begins with a single seed. So, this whole ocean of karma, with one single act, an entire ocean, an entire forest can be created. And once we are in this forest, when there is only one tree, everything is visible for us. It is visible to us. We know how to go to reach different places because we can see the surroundings. Slowly, as more trees grow, more trees grow, more trees grow, we are in the middle of a dense jungle. We don't know. We are seeking aimlessly for the path. We get lost. Different things in life will start pulling us. Do I want to do this or this or this or this or this, satisfy this desire or this desire or this desire, or shall I focus on my spiritual goal? So Bhagavan says, don't think that action is supreme. Don't think that through action you can get permanent peace or happiness. You will finally get lost. And it will be the reason for your downfall. And it will also halt your progress in transactional life and in spiritual life also. So we will end with this one legend from the Devi Purana. There was once a demon called Rakta Bijasura. So Rakta Bijasura, he had this special boon. If somebody tried to kill him in warfare or in some kind of a fight, every drop of blood from his body that fell onto the ground will make another Rakta Bijasura, another duplicate of him, spring up immediately. So nobody could kill him because every time they tried to kill him, so many drops of blood would fall on the ground and that many Rakta Bijasuras would spring up. So Devi, it is said, she stretched out her tongue so that the goddess, when she was fighting with him, she was on a war, and every time a drop of blood came out, she would stretch out her tongue and lick it up. So no drop of blood fell to the ground and she was able to kill him. This seems a little gross to us, gruesome also, but it is only an allegory. It is a metaphor. So here the Puranas are telling us every single desire of yours will result in multiple other desires. And you cannot come to the end of desire. You cannot say, I will stop having desires from today. They will keep springing up because the vasanas are there, impressions are there inside. So they will keep bringing up new desire. And every new desire will bring in a host of other desires. So the tongue of the goddess, the outstretched tongue of the goddess, it actually denotes viveka, discrimination. So when you are able to discriminate, you become a witness and allow desires, if they come up like bubbles in the mind, let it come. Without engaging with the desire, you witness. You be silent inside, just witness, Bhagavan says. So when you witness like that, desires will come and they will go away. They will come and they will go away without again giving rise to a host of other desires. So today we have looked at how action cannot be supreme because instruments of action are inert, therefore every action is inert. Most of our actions performed by the three instruments, body, mind, and intellect, they're all unconscious. They're coming from the vasanas within us, which are unconscious, which we are not aware of, which have been collected over lifetimes. So because of this, any act that we perform is likely to be a mixed bag. It will bring us a mixed bag of karmic fruit. And every desire or wish that we would like to fulfill, as soon as we fulfill that one wish, many others, it will give rise to many others, which will create an ocean of karma, from which it is difficult for us to disentangle ourselves, and we will lose sight of the goal. So today, Bhagavan has given us a very powerful tool. He has said, witness. As vasanas come up, witness. As things happen outside, witness. Remain centered in your true identity, the infinite self, infinite bliss, infinite peace. That is your true nature. So if we have any questions, we can take it now. You can either put it on chat or
Stop sharing.
I'll stop sharing the presentation. Let me see. Talking about the mind, is it good to keep the mind almost blank when no action is performed by long yoga practice? Neither a good or bad thought. As Bhagavan says, chumma iru, maybe less than few hundred thoughts a day only. Is it good for spiritual growth? Actually, keeping the mind free from thoughts, if we are suppressing thoughts, it depends on how we keep the mind free from thoughts. We can keep the mind free from thoughts by suppressing thoughts, so that as soon as a thought comes, we try to suppress. This gives rise to a sort of conflict in the mind. Even when emotions arise, now some kind of jealousy is arising, then immediately a counter thought will come. It is bad to be jealous. I'll get negative karma, so I don't want jealousy. So this constantly creates a counter thought, and it creates conflict, and it creates suppression. So making the mind silent through suppression, though it has its benefits because it gives you a little peace, but it doesn't work in the long run. So Vedanta says, Ramana says, allow your mind to lull itself into silence because of understanding. Either you inquire, what is my true nature? Who am I? We will come to who am I practice in a few more shlokas. Or just keep on contemplating over spiritual truths, so that as your exploration goes deeper and deeper, you come more and more in tune with your true nature of bliss and peace. So there is no suppression of thought going on. This kind of silence is coming because of better understanding of your own true nature. So this kind of silence, or you can get silence, like Bhagavan was telling us just now, by witnessing. Whatever comes, I don't engage with it, I just witness. So thoughts may come and thoughts may go, but if I don't engage with that thought, then there is no karma. I'm just watching, that's all. It comes and it goes. I am not putting it into action. I am not engaging in a dialogue with that thought. So witnessing means I'm just there. I am the ground of awareness where the thought manifests and then it dissolves. My question is as below, is it really possible to do nothing or attain to this state without any practice of other sadhanas? Now, when we are talking about do nothing, we are not saying that you don't fulfill your responsibilities, or you don't engage in any tasks, or you don't do any work from morning till night, don't use your mind, intellect, or body. No, that is not what Bhagavan is saying. In fact, Bhagavan, as we keep going through the series, we'll see more and more. From 2 o'clock in the morning till late in the night, he was constantly engaged in action. He would work in the kitchen, he would cut vegetables, he would cook for his devotees, he would go and bring herbs from the forest, he would write books, he would do proofreading, he would discuss with jnanis, he would mend books, he would mend toys of children, he would build walls. So there's nothing that he did not do. So it is not about not engaging in action through body, mind, and intellect. Here, not acting only means that I don't get into the feeling of doership. This is happening through the body, mind, and intellect. If the car is going on the road, I don't say, I am the car. I don't identify with the vehicle, or I don't say this is, I am the mixer. I don't say I am the iron box, I am the fan. But here we are making the mistake of saying I am these instruments of body, mind, and intellect. So by doing nothing, it only means that I don't have the feeling of doership. I don't, even though action is being performed, I'm witnessing the action being performed without feeling that I am performing that action. To come to this state, you need what is called Chitta Shuddhi. So Chitta Shuddhi means purity of mind. Bhagavan defines purity of mind very simply. He says Chitta Shuddhi means being able to focus on only one thought without anything else pulling you in different directions. It also means the mind and intellect are very subtle and very sharp. So to come to this state, sadhana of karma yoga, that means performing action without expecting fruit for oneself, performing it for the good of others, offering action to God, saying, I offer the fruit of action to you. It is okay. Whatever you want, you give me or you don't give me. I'm not doing this for myself. That is karma yoga. Or you may say bhakti yoga, japa, and upasana, that means mentally meditating on a divine form, etc. All this will help to bring purity to the mind. It will kill many vasanas which are binding us, which are pulling us in different directions. And it helps us to come to a state where we can start engaging in witnessing. Then what else is there? Prarabdha, does Prarabdha karma determine the place where one is born? Yes, it does determine the place where we are born, the family we are born into, the body that we come into. So all this is determined by Prarabdha karma. One small question. Ordainer makes each one act according to one's Prarabdha. What are the simple steps we can follow in our mundane life to reduce the Prarabdha other than being in Sakshi Bhava? Just like we listened to the entire, during the entire discussion, we have been saying you cannot stop an arrow that has already been let loose. We are not at the same time aware. We don't remember past actions. Even in this very life, if you ask me this time, 5 days ago, what were you doing? I probably won't remember unless it's something very momentous that I have done. So even in this very lifetime, most of the actions that I have done, the thoughts that I have thought, if you tell me in the morning at 10 o'clock, what were you thinking? I don't know. Yes, I thought something, but I don't remember. So in this very lifetime, I don't remember what I think, what I feel. Now, if I think, I can't remember everything that I thought in this lifetime, or I did. So definitely, I don't remember what happened in my past lifetimes also. So I don't know what has been set in action, what chain of action has been started off by my past actions. I cannot predict. So it will keep happening. It is not because of some god or divinity or somebody's curse or anything that it is happening. It is a learning process. It's a fine. So what I did, I'm learning from that. I did some mistake, so I'm learning now. I did something good, that part is growing in me. Something bad, that part I'm recognizing and I'm just witnessing and eliminating. So that's why Bhagavan says, because you don't know what is going to come. Outside, you keep doing what you need to do. Some challenge comes in your life, yes, you have to think through it. You have to think of how to resolve it. You have to get into physical action if required. So you have to do everything that is required outside, because I don't know what is the final fruit of that, what it is going to be. So I do my best to resolve it. At the same time, inside, I remain in a state of witnessing. Whether it works or it doesn't work, it doesn't affect my state of inner well-being. How is prarabdha expressed? How is a place influenced by the prarabdha? I think we have gone sufficiently. Prarabdha is expressed through circumstances outside, through vasanas inside. How is a place influenced by prarabdha? Actually, place does not influence you as much as what is inside. Our mind and intellect are closer to us than anything that is outside. So if we keep the inside, inner state of being calm and peaceful and in a mode of witnessing as much as possible, then no place can affect us adversely. Inside is more important than what is outside. Then can we ask for Shama for actions and nullify through meditation? So I think we are going off tangentially into karma. However, yes, asking Shama is okay, but we have to look at our present state. See, if we are being very critical of other people, then automatically that will come back to us. So Annie Besant actually gives us a clue. She says, if you're always involved in a lot of worry, you don't have to go back into past life regression or try to wonder what I did which is making this happen. If we look at our own lives, we see the same kind of circumstances repeating again and again. So she says, if you are always have a tendency to worry too much, you get into panic, you get into anxiety, you get into stress, you're always worrying about something. Normally it comes from a critical nature. Maybe you've been criticizing other people too much, outside or inside, which has made them worry, which has depleted their confidence and made them worry. So that is coming back to you as a worrying nature. So in my life, in my own life, if I see certain circumstances have been repeating again and again to teach me certain lessons. So if we look at that and we start making corrections. Okay, I have this tendency to trust people too much, or I have this tendency to doubt people too much. I have this tendency to seek my own comfort all the time. I have this tendency to not empathize with people. So by objectively looking at ourselves, we can discover what are the things that we need to correct. So correction is all that is happening through karma. So through karma, we have differentiated ourselves. This is me, this is not me. There is a strong dichotomy. I, the world, and God. But karma is pushing us to a state of oneness, where we need to realize I and the other person is also a part of my own self. They are not different. So karma is pushing us in the direction of love. It is pushing us in the direction of empathy. It is pushing us in the direction of oneness with all beings. So the more we cultivate this, automatically karmic effect will get reduced. The more we cultivate empathy, more we cultivate love, more we cultivate peace, more we cultivate empathy towards all beings. That is Kshama. That is forgiveness. Not verbally saying, please forgive me, or even repenting, but actually moving more and more towards love, peace, and oneness.